Thank you very much, Chair. Thank you for the invitation to participate in this conference. It's a huge honor for me. So what you see here is this beautiful subtropical rainforest. This was the first stop of the Big Scrub trip that we made, the pre-conference field trip to the Big Scrub area over the weekend. Transformed completely from pasture, former pasture land at just about 25 years ago. It is a remarkable result of mixed tree planting that extended over a period of about 10 years. At the center of what made all this possible is the remarkable personal input of passion, as well as financial and other resources by the landowner, Tony Parks, who many of you would recognize to be a leader figure of forest restoration efforts in the Big Scrub area. I don't know if Tony is in the audience or not, but he was absolutely inspirational when we were doing our field trip. So he was asked during the field trip by us, what drove you to do all this? And his answer was very simple, yet to me extremely awe-inspiring. It was the pain to see nature being displaced, and it was a deeply felt urgency to help bring her back. Now, please allow me to bring you very briefly to another very different corner of the world in northern China. Fengling would have just been another regular town, far removed from urban centers, with little economic or political importance, except for one thing. It is where the River Luan originates, and River Luan is one of the major water sources for China's water-hungry capital, Beijing. So what you see here is a 6-year-old Chinese red pine plantation that has been planted meticulously by the local forestry bureau. It is a result of a long-running payment for ecosystem services program, whereby the Beijing government pays for Fengling to reforest along the route of the River Luan to ensure the cities and the rivers and also the city's water supply. So these two cases are among a wide range of forest restoration programs worldwide, particularly under today's policy climate that we're paying increasing attention to the importance of forest restoration. I hope they also illustrate two quite different examples of forest restoration to represent the wide range of motivations behind forest restoration programs. We have some of them that have explicit goals of restoring or reinstating native ecosystems, but many of them also are basically all about ecosystem functions and services. So, many forest restoration programs start with the goal, or at least the hope, to bring about a suite of environmental benefits, such as to do with water, to do with climate, to do with soil and biodiversity, but also social benefits, including timber production, public health, and financial return to the landowners. But particularly for the case that I mentioned, that's represented by the case in China, the Fengling case, where programs are designed not necessarily for the benefit of native ecosystems or biodiversity. There is an increasing recognition among the restoration community that there is a risk that biodiversity could be displaced outside of the decision-making space of restoration. How to put this biodiversity back into the decision-making space of restoration programs is the theme of my talk today. In particular, I aim to approach this question from two perspectives to aim to provide one potential answer to this question. I will first start with a series of field studies that we have been conducting over the past few years in China to provide a case-specific perspective, which then will lead me to go on to a global scale meta-analysis to try to explore a more broader perspective and possibly leverage points. So all this work I'm presenting today is a result of wonderful support and input from a range of, a large number of collaborators and mentors and a large number of research institutions from different parts of the world. So their input is genuinely appreciated here. So to China first. The context of the series of work I'm going to share with you today concerns something called, or a program called the Grain for Green program. It is a nationwide program in China that actually had the central goal of soil erosion control at the center of the design. So I guess up here on the upper corner you can see a fairly striking picture of slope cropland in some parts of China that historically used to be heavily affected by soil erosion processes. And the Grain for Grain program is actually designed to solve this problem because in 1998, China had nationwide a series of flood events that caused huge economic damage. And almost overnight, the government woke up to the challenge of very real consequences of forest destruction. And almost overnight, in 1999, installed the nationwide Grain for Green program. So the program operates by incentivizing rural households to reforest their sloped cropland above 25 degrees in slope. And crucially, the program does not have a particular focus on native ecosystems, where instead it kind of functions on the assumption that any kind of tree cover is good for solving the soil erosion problem. And as you could see from the picture here, this is a picture taken from southwestern China at a project site of the Grain for Green program. You could probably have seen from the homogeneous texture of the forest cover on the slope that the tree cover being put in place are not necessarily native forest tree cover, because in this region the native forest ecosystem would have been temperate, subtropical temperate broadleaf forest. So anyway, the program is large in scale. It's operating in 26 out of China's 31 mainland provinces. And over a period of about 15 years, it has installed about 28 million hectares of forest all across China. And to put that in local perspective, this equals to about 35% of the land area of New South Wales. So it's huge. And we know that plantations are by nature very different from native ecosystems or native forests. And this brings into focus, for me at least, the question of how does biodiversity figure into this whole context? Is there a danger that this program, even though it's been so successful at establishing such large areas of forest, is it displacing biodiversity out of the dividend space of forest restoration? So to look into this question, we conducted a series of field projects in an area in southwestern China, in Sichuan province, to try to provide a multidisciplinary perspective into it. So we started by conducting a region-wide remote sensing analysis, looking at the land cover change between 2000 and 2015. If you remember, I mentioned the program started in 1999. So 2000 would mark a time point when the program had just about begun to establish tree cover. Particularly, we differentiated among several types of forest, taking particular care to differentiate native forest apart from several types of plantations. That's been the predominant outcome of Grain for Green in this area. So this produced two land cover maps of the two time points, which we overlay to estimate the nature and extent of forest cover change and land cover change in general for this region. So by and large, here are the main findings. We found that the region as a whole, the most dominant change or prominent change of land cover between the study time periods was the conversion of croplands to monoculture, then followed by mixed plantations. As a result, tree cover actually increased by 32%. It's a pretty big number, but this increase has been entirely accounted for by plantations. And in contrast, native forests actually suffered displacement, not only because the area of native forest decreased by about 7%, but also because the land area that was retired or made available from cropland retirement that could have been restored into native forest was actually taken up by tree plantations. So to provide you with a more kind of concrete image of what's been happening. So this area, I don't know, some of you might have been there. I know Ting has been to this area. It's a famous nature reserve set up in southwestern China for the purpose of conserving pandas. And actually down here, these buildings here are the famous panda breeding center that's been supplying panda babies to all over the world. So what you see here is you can see the lower mountain slope here. These are obviously plantation looking, and they're actually Japanese larch, kind of commissioned by the local government to be planted in these mountain slopes that used to be cornfields. And ironically, well, to me, it seems ironical really that this site actually just represents just about the best kind of scenario where native or natural regeneration could have been the most efficient way of restoring native forest, because it's very close by to native forest on the mountain slope, and it's right at the doorstep of a nature reserve. So next, we conducted a series of biodiversity analysis looking at bees and birds, using them as indicator species to look into the biodiversity implications of the land cover change involved under the Green for Green. After yesterday's plenary, David's talk, I feel like, thank goodness I didn't just do birds. So here, what I'm going to show you is the results based on species richness analysis. But I should just say that in the interest of time, the results are based on abundance analysis show essentially the same result. I'm just not presenting them today in the interest of time. So here on the y-axis, I'm going to plot the species richness extrapolated from species accumulation curves of both taxa. For birds in particular, we did surveys for both breeding season and non-breeding season. That's why you see there are several clusters on the x-axis here. And I'm going to plot the species richness for each of the land cover types involved under Green for Green. So let's take an example from birds during the non-breeding season. We see that compared to cropland, which is the target land cover for restoration or reforestation, which is coded in yellow circle here, mixed plantation coded in purple diamond actually performed better in terms of species richness compared to cropland. But if you look at other types of plantation, all of them being monoculture plantations, they are performing less compared to cropland, which is, again, ironical because the purpose of, well, I guess restoration, the outcome of the restoration is doing more poorly for biodiversity compared to the so-called degraded state. Now, all of this land cover performed less well compared to native forest here, even though the native forest we could find in the region was all degraded native forest because the human influence has been so rampant that there's just no old growth forest left in the area. Extending the results to birds during the breeding season and bees, we see generally the same results, but I should just point out that for bees, when you look at the comparison of mixed forest or mixed plantation compared to monoculture plantation, the advantage of mixed plantations disappears over monoculture plantation. So for bees, they are equally bad. Now, so this brings me to the kind of conclusion that, the best possible outcome for biodiversity, at least, of reforestation in this context would have been to restore native forest. But if we cannot change the premise of the program to target native forest, if we still have to go the plantation way, there is a better way to do it still. That is to use mixed plantations instead of monocultures. So this brings me back to the initial question I posed. How do we try to carve out decision-making space for biodiversity when the program's premise is not about biodiversity per se? So the answer for this is to come from a series of socioeconomic analysis I'm going to present next, based on household interviews. So the first question that's really important is to try to understand what drove households to make the decision that they made. In other words, why did they choose the plantations they chose to do the reforestation? And it turns out that the most important two reasons are the profitability of forest production. They generally tend to go for what they perceive to be the most profitable forest type. And then, really interestingly, is the role of government. And it turns out that almost all the places we visited in this region, local governments have been encouraging the planting of single tree species. And the mixed plantation I mentioned earlier actually is a result of farmers over time gradually introducing species of their own accord. Now, with this result, and particularly the importance of profitability, we thought it was really interesting and important to look into the profit margins of, the profit, kind of like the scenario, the situation of profits for monoculture and mixed plantations, to see if there may be any leverage points. Because if you remember from my previous slides, for birds at least, mixed plantations performed better than monoculture, and mixed plantations do not carry additional penalty for bees. So in other words, mixed plantation would have been a better option for biodiversity. And it turns out there's really no difference in terms of profitability. And I think one reason to explain this seemingly counterintuitive result is because in that region, land holding size is generally very small. During our survey, we realized that actually the average household owns just about 0.4 hectares of land. So even though you have mixed plantations in a particular area, the mixed plantation is actually the result of multiple households choosing to plant different tree species. So in other words, these mixed plantations, they're all kind of managed as small-scale monocultures, which leads to, at least to me, to the speculation that the economy of scale would have disappeared in this context. We also looked into how important the income from plantation production is out of the household income structure. And it turns out that the median value for the region is just about 5%. In other words, production from plantations is not really contributing a significant or too much proportion of household income. So particularly these last 2 points, I thought, to me at least, indicates that there are some real possibilities or opportunities for nudging the behavioral choice toward more biodiversity-friendly approach. Because where there's no difference between monoculture and mixed plantations in terms of profitability, this indicates that there's really very little possible opportunity cost if we nudge rural households, landowners to go from monoculture to mixed plantations. And the low percentage of household income coming from forest production indicates that even if we're going to dare to think even bolder steps to nudge the restoration of native forest, the cost, potential cost that's needed to nudge that land use choice possibly is not very high. So in sum, this series of research indicates that the economics of quote-unquote better in the biodiversity sense, restoration or reforestation outcomes are fairly conducive. And the key really is to install proper or appropriate policy and incentive mechanisms to nudge the behavior or the land use decisions of households towards that direction. And government policies play really an outsized role in households' decision-making about their reforestation. So the onus is really on the government to try to think of proper policy mechanism and incentive mechanism. So overall, I would argue that there's a strong case for revising the policy and incentive scheme for biodiversity gains. That is to encourage native forest restoration instead of simply planting plantation-style trees, but with an important caveat, which is, if you remember, Green for Green program is designed with the goal of soil erosion control in mind. It's not designed to benefit biodiversity necessarily, even though it's an implicit kind of hope. Which means that if we're going to follow my argument about biodiversity, a critical assumption or foundation for this argument is that what is good for biodiversity is not going to jeopardize the goal of soil erosion control. And thinking more broadly, I think this foundation applies actually to a suite of other environmental benefits and social benefits. So essentially what I'm saying is to carve out decision-making space for biodiversity when the goal of ecological restoration is not necessarily about native ecosystem per se. We need to understand the synergies and trade-offs between biodiversity and these other ecosystem services or the benefits that policymakers really care about. I think this links back really nicely to Bruce's presentation just now that, typically policymakers are concerned not necessarily directly about biodiversity. They may care about other things. And how to align the interest of ecological restoration of native ecosystems for biodiversity with these other benefits that policymakers really care about, I think that's a key for the science community to figure out. So this leads me to the second part of my talk, where my colleagues and I attempt to do a global scale meta-analysis, focusing on three ecosystem services that typically has been talked about in the restoration discussion, particularly under this current discussion about climate change. So we focus on carbon storage, soil retention, and water regulation as three key ecosystem services that are at the center of the agenda driving ecosystem services. And then for each of these metrics, for each of these environmental axes, we used one metric only, just because the scale of this analysis would have been quite big already. Just to make things tractable, we focus on one metric for each environmental axis. So for biodiversity, we used species abundance as the measure because we think this is the most sensitive and most meaningful measure. We used above ground biomass to represent carbon storage benefits. We used the reverse of soil erosion to measure the benefit of soil erosion control or soil retention. And then we used water infiltration as well as the reverse of runoff to represent water regulation services. So essentially, this project is all about mapping out where the co-benefits may lie between biodiversity and the ecosystem services that policymakers really care about when it comes to forest restoration. So because of this, there's two main considerations that went into our data collection. First is the data we are going to focus on, of course, have to do with the 4 metrics I just mentioned, but also they need to be for specific forest types that are the outcome of forest restoration. And these would include the list I put down here. Secondary forest as the outcome of natural regeneration, restored native forest, which we have seen a lot here in Australia, and tree plantations, which, like I showed in the case of China, have been a predominant outcome of restoration in many other parts of the world. Importantly, we also decided that it's crucial to put these measurements in context with a reference ecosystem. So we decided that for any data to go into our database, they have to have a matched baseline of better practice forest type. So whenever possible, we included primary forest in the database, but this is limited by the amount, the availability of data. And primary forest would serve as the ultimate benchmark for the forest types I'm listing up there. So it could be the benchmark for any type of those forest types. Whenever this is not possible, and this happens a lot, we use any kind of native forest to serve as the benchmark. And this would be appropriate only for tree plantations as the forest type being compared to this benchmark. So just for a conceptual diagram, for me to kind of walk over the idea with you. Imagine we have a case where there's 2 types of forest as a result of restoration, shown here in red and in green. I realize this is not the best choice of color. I apologize for that. If we plot the performance of these forest types on the 4 environmental axes I discussed earlier, I think this kind of graph will not only show us where the synergies and trade-offs may lie between or among the 4 axes, but also it can very clearly highlight which one of the options would be the better one. So from this diagram, it would be apparent that the best kind of data, the most ideal kind of data to go into the analysis would be a single study that contributes multiple forest types for comparison and on 4 environmental metrics, right? But it turns out that no such thing exists. Basically, we're not able to find any data, empirical data, which is not surprising. I'll talk more about how we try to get around that in a bit. But this basically limits our options. And eventually we decided that we would relax our criteria to include any study that has at least 1 metric out of the 4, and that concerns at least 2 forest types, including, crucially, 1 reference baseline. So after a pretty extensive search over the past 1 year, we compiled a global database of about 600 pairs of records. So I should just point out that any pair of records essentially means there's the forest type as a result of forest restoration and a reference baseline coming from the same study system by the same paper, reported by the same paper. And for biodiversity, the species abundance data, 1 pair of data refers to 1 community data set on the resolution of individual species. So you see the global distribution of the data points here coded in different colors. And I should just also point out that the geographical coverage of each individual metric actually can be quite different. In other words, the database for soil erosion could be geographically separated from the data points for carbon. So for the purpose of this talk, I'm going to focus on only 1 question that's most relevant to the context of the case study I presented to you from China. So how do plantations compare with native forests in terms of the bundle of environmental benefits? I probably hinted at this earlier, but just to clarify that, the data that went into analysis for this question all are pairs of data of what's a restored forest type compared with a reference baseline. So we used the log of the ratio of the performance between these forest types, and that's the data that we entered into the analysis. So here, I'll start presenting to you what we call a tier 1 analysis, basically meta-analysis based on individual metrics, here plotted on the y-axis here. And so for the purpose of biodiversity, we divided them into 6 different taxa groups. And this represents carbon sequestration of above ground biomass, soil erosion, and water infiltration. So on the x-axis, I'm going to present the value of the meta-analysis derived value of the comparison of the performance between the 2 types of forest, the degraded forest that's a result of restoration and the reference baseline. So in the form of log ratios. I hope I'm not confusing everybody. So I'm going, the plot is going to involve both the mean of the analysis as well as the 95% confidence interval. So first, let's look at biodiversity. It turns out that for every taxa, they show consistent patterns of negative performance of plantations versus native forest baseline, which is not surprising at all, which came to the green overall outcome across all taxa. So this is consistent with what our current understanding is, that plantations tend to be performing worse compared to native forests in terms of biodiversity. Hardly surprising. What about the other ecosystem services? It turns out that they all show consistent negative responses of plantations versus native forest. And perhaps most striking to me personally, we see that soil erosion control is actually the worst out of the four, meaning it's performing even worse than biodiversity in plantations compared to native forest. And linking back to the China study I mentioned to you earlier, it seems very obvious to me now, at least based on this data set we have, that the bigger loser of environmental service out of the Grain for Green program is actually not biodiversity, but the very goal of the reforestation program itself. But this analysis has a problem. Like I mentioned, the geographical distribution of the data sets between different metrics are not necessarily the same, which means that for the soil data set, or for some metric, the data may mostly come from tropical regions, whereas for the other data set, it may mostly come from temperate regions. So they're not necessarily comparable. So to get around this, we, like I mentioned also, there's just no perfect bundles that come from the same study. So we had to do some kind of magic to get around this. The way we chose to do was we overlay the distribution of these data points with the Holdridge life zone map. And if you know about it, Holdridge life zone is basically a geographical division of forest types based on rainfall, based on climate conditions. So they basically divide the world's ecosystems into polygons of different types of ecosystem. So we identified data points that come from the same Holdridge zone and artificially matched them up to be bundles of different metrics. I hope that makes sense to you. So it turns out that we have, out of the 600 also data points, we generated just about 11 bundles coming from the same Holdridge zone within the bundle. And there's only two bundles for three metrics. It turns out there's no bundles at all for all four metrics. So let's take a look at just one example of the three metric bundle, how it performs. So here is a polar diagram where I'm going to present the performance, again, of the response ratio. So performance of the restored forest type versus reference baseline on the log scale on the three axes here. So this bundle has the three metrics here shown here, and it's from the border between China, Vietnam, and Thailand. And the center, sorry, the thick line you see here, the sixth circle here, is the value of 0, meaning this is the line where plantations would perform similarly to native forest. And going toward the center of the graph would be -2. That's the largest possible value we could get out of this data set, which means within the circle, you have performance of plantations being worse than native forest. And outside of the circle, it would be better performance than native forest. So what we find is all these small violet dots, they represent individual data points of the performance of the respective metric from this bundle. And the gray dot, the bigger in size, that's the average value of that metric. So we see that by and large, for this bundle, at least, most of the performance of the data points suggest that plantations perform worse on all three accounts compared to native forests. There are some exceptions, like this dot and this dot. Plantations seem to perform better than native forest. So what about the other bundles? So I did this really confusing graph to show you. So essentially, it's the same polar graph, except that it's got 4 axes now, because, like I mentioned, there's many other bundles, totaling 11 bundles. So we have 4 metrics here: biodiversity, carbon, soil, and water, right? So every dot is the mean of that metric from one bundle. And I used the same color to code data points coming from the same bundle, and I used a line, a curve, to connect the bundles. So I hope they all take the same color out of one bundle. So I guess the takeaway message overall from this graph is that we see most of the data points falling within the circle, which indicates that plantations by and large perform worse compared to native forest on all these accounts. That's the predominant signal we get from this analysis. So, in general, what we find from this set of analysis is that native forest is predominantly associated with higher levels of ecosystem services in addition to higher biodiversity, which came somewhat as a surprise to me because of, like I mentioned, the implicit assumption that many reforestation programs take that plantations are equally good at delivering the other ecosystem service benefits. And perhaps more importantly to me, there is a remarkable synergy we found between biodiversity and these other ecosystem services that policymakers tend to care much more about. And this argues that there is significant environmental co-benefits that can be a strong argument for native forest restoration as the most beneficial restoration strategy, even when the agenda of the restoration program is not necessarily about biodiversity. So, looking more broadly, I think this kind of analysis, actually, I see it as more like maybe even a concept, a demonstration of concept because of the limitation of what one single study can do. But I think thinking about these other environmental or social benefits that restoration programs are supposed to deliver, I think it's very important for us to understand more broadly how do they synergize or trade off with each other. Particularly in terms of timber production, we see that plantations tend to be a major argument for, timber production tend to be a major argument for setting up plantations in many different parts of the world. And again, linking back to Bruce's point about finding the co-benefits of where the co-benefits lie. And I see the chair is already trying to chase me off, so I'm actually finishing now. So again, tying back to the larger picture, we face challenges and we face immense opportunities, and how to find the overlapping space between the native ecosystem, the biodiversity that we really care about as a community, with these other opportunities presented by policy, I think is an urgent topic for us as scientists and practitioners. With that, I would like to thank you for your audience.
We've probably run over a little bit of time, so thank you very much, Fangyuan. But I'm sure if you ask Fangyuan at lunch, any questions you've got, she'll be more than willing to answer them. But once again, thank you very much for your presentation.